Welcome to the newest episode of the Needless Things podcast. On today's episode, we are talking to Tim Seeley. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, you've been on my list for a while, going all the way back to G.I. Joe stuff. I've been a fan of your work, but Hack Slash Revival, which we're going to end up talking about Revival quite a bit, I think. So I'm thrilled to be talking to you because it's one of those things where you read the comics and as the years go on, you're like, oh, these sensibilities really line up. This is one of my guys. You know what I mean?
Sure.
What before we get into the works though, what's your background? Like growing up, what was influencing you? What toys were you collecting? Like what was shaping your brain back then?
Uh, I mean, I grew up in central Wisconsin, like small town, like one of those 1,000 people town kind of places, very rural. And I had two brothers, and we would just, my dad was a big nerd, and my parents were always supportive. So like, I grew up on B horror movies. My dad got a VCR like in 1981 or whatever, 1982, and then it was just a constant feed of horror movies. I watched Conan the Barbarian when I was 5. All
Oh,
this sort of things I probably should have done. Horror movies and all that sort of stuff really early. And then comics were just such a big part of it. My parents had both read comics as kids, so they were, as long as we were reading, I think they were willing to support it. So even though we were like lower middle class and we're definitely not rich, we got a trip to Green Bay once a month or every other month to go get some comics out of the quarter bins and stuff while they went to Red Lobster, which was a big deal then. So, um, but I mean, I just always was from that point on, probably from when I was 5, just always drawing. Just want this is the stuff I want to do, and just always, um, you know, horror, superheroes, fantasy, that kind of stuff. Masters of the Universe was my big thing as a kid. It's kind of where I got into comics. I think around the same time I got a Spider-Man comic and those mini comics that came with the Master of the Universe figure. So it was just like this. The Master of the Universe ended up being this perfect storm of shit I liked. It was like space dudes and fantasy ladies and monsters and spaceships, and so it was like the most perfect thing I could ever have encountered. So and so I think like all those things put together ends up making the guy who spends his next 30 years making horror, uh, 80s comics, 80s action figure comics, and sexy stuff like that. Just all those things were so formative in my brain. I think that's the kind of stuff I really want to make and have really luckily made for the majority of my professional career.
well, and that's having followed your dreams in that way, you've had the opportunity to work on some of those franchises that were around back then that influenced us when we were kids. Uh, is there one specific that stands out to you that maybe not necessarily your dream project, but one that you feel like, man, like going into it, maybe you thought, oh, this is a dream, but maybe there was something else that popped up that you're like, this turned out to be like opportunity wise or creatively wise, one that delivered more than you expected, maybe.
Oh, I mean, so many of them in a way. I mean, I think the GI Joe obviously is probably the one that hit just at such a perfect time. I didn't really. I grew up with GI Joe a little. My brother was more of a GI Joe fan. I liked the comic, but I wasn't like a big GI Joe figure collector. I had a few, but I definitely loved the comic. And when I was 16, 17, 18, I was going to comic conventions. Now tabling by myself, and that's when I met Josh Blaylock, who would go on to make Devil's Due. But
Mm.
one I was in college, and Josh and I were working on stuff. We were working on a comic submission for Image Comics, of which they didn't take. But Josh was doing some stickers for a local sticker company, and we did a Baroness one, and it was I drew it. So because drawing babes in leather and stuff was my thing back even then, and we got a cease and desist for it. Josh did, but
Oh,
that gave us the address of the Hasbro licensee. So Josh used that to ask them if he could license GI Joe, and at the time there was just nothing for GI Joe, and so we ended up getting that, and Josh was working on that for about about a year before he needed help, because it was, it was a juggernaut, and so that's the opportunity that led me to. I moved from Minneapolis to Chicago, took a full time job at Dell's Do, and then just knowing how to work with Hasbro meant that by like issue 16, I was drawing it full time, while occasionally writing stuff too. So yeah, I mean, I owe GI Joe big time. I wouldn't have the longevity of the career or even that just entry point. I think for all the stuff that came later, if not for GI Joe.
And isn't it funny with GI Joe that because one of our offshoot things is we do a GI Joe podcast, uh, and it's so funny in talking about sort of the history of the franchise. It feels like every time they bring it back, to a certain extent, Hasbro. Now, Real American Hero probably they kind of knew they had something, but I feel like since then Hasbro's been like, well, let's give old GI Joe a shot again, and with the with the time frame you're referencing, like it blew up. I don't
Yeah,
think Hasbro expected the reaction, and then a few years after that, for the 25th anniversary, it blew up,
yeah,
and then they ended up making a movie out of it, and now again with Classified, Hasbro was kind of like, well, let's sort of tentatively dip a toe back into GI Joe, and now again it's massive, like one of the best performing toy lines on the market right now. It's wild that something people have always defined as so difficult to bring forward, because in the 80s Real American Hero, obviously the rah-rah patriotism and everything else that went along with it really slotted into that
yeah,
pop culture zeitgeist. But now, for years people have been like, well, it's kind of hard to portray that in a modern setting. And yet it
yeah.
still keeps succeeding. It's there's something weird about that. And you'd think, you mentioned Masters of the Universe, which to me is much more evergreen. Like
Yeah,
fantasy mixed with science fiction. There's no era attached to it. There's no specific like sentiment needed for it. But
sure.
I feel like that's had a harder road.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I've definitely thought about this quite a bit. And I think part of it with GI Joe, um, is it does rely on these sort of consecutive waves of nostalgia, and you do see it suffer a little in a way that Transformers never does. So
Yeah.
I think if you ever see anything in Hasbro that's a little bit reticent to do anything with it, it's their guy. They're not judging it by Masters of the Universe or Black Star or Crystar or something. They're judging it by Transformers. Um,
Uh,
and I think if you look at the or My Little Pony, I mean, those are things that are like as brands that never sort of have these dips in interest or nostalgia, um, which GI Joe does. I mean, Master Universe does, and other things. Thundercats, they do. But like, it's the competition with Transformers that always makes it tougher. And you even see when Skybound rolled out these books, they started with Transformers.
yeah.
They knew what they were doing. You had to build people up as to get to GI Joe, and it worked great. I mean, it was a really smart way to do it. But that was a strategy because everybody kind of on this side of things at least knows it is hard with GI Joe. I think it comes off, differently to kids now than it did. It seems, I think, if you look at what kids are into now, as an action figure, Joe doesn't quite hit whereas Transformers still does.
Yeah.
So all the Joe toys that are out now are aimed at adult collectors, but there are plenty of Transformers figures that are aimed at kids. So that's a huge part of it, I think.
That's a really good point too. As fans who are into many different things, I have many times said, Masters Universe Origins is doing this. Why can't we see something like this from GI Joe or whatever else? But you bring up a really good point. Hasbro's not looking at it that way. Hasbro's looking at, like you said, their legendary cash cow Transformers
Yeah,
that has really never more than stumbled.
I mean, not since you think of Transformers. There was a brief moment around like 92, 93 where there wasn't really a lot of Transformers stuff out, and that's maybe like 5 years until 97 or 98 when we get 97 when we get Beast Wars, right?
Yeah.
And there has been a steady flow of Transformers stuff since then. I mean, you think of the oil used to make Transformers figures, or wise, it's just all that plastic.
Um,
They,
that's why it's so warm outside. It's Transformers.
right? They're just it's such a success, which. it's just not quite the same. And the movies too. You know, GI Joe, there is movies, but they weren't as successful as Transformers. They just weren't, not even close, really. You know, I mean, I think it's and part of it's, you know, there's well, there's a whole lot of reasons probably going into that, but the big things you can do with Transformers are just things that are a lot harder to do with Joe.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like there is spectacle with GI Joe, but Transformers are spectacle. You know what
Yeah,
I mean?
and it just works for everybody. Everyone on Earth can be, and from here to Korea to, you know, it doesn't to the North Pole. Like you can show someone, hey, it's a robot. It turns into a car, and they go, shit, that's cool. That
Yeah,
just always works. Whereas like you show a 12-year-old, you know, Duke, and they're like lame. It's
right.
just all you're always going to have some amount of that, you know. And I think Master of the Universe has a somewhat similar thing. You know, it works. It does work for kids somewhat, but kids don't play with action figures like they used to, which is always
Yeah.
going to be sort of a problem. You know, but I think there's also the sort of the aspect of just you've got a whole generation of kids that did not grow up on Conan or Flash Gordon. They grew up on manga and anime, so you know they see, you know, Western influenced barbarian guy, and it doesn't connect to them in the same way. You know, it's a little tougher to do, I think, for that.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because you're right. Our generation that grew up with Masters, that is where those influences were coming from, and those things are, you know, some companies are still kind of trying to keep Flash Gordon and stuff around. Like
Yeah,
NECA are my heroes for
yeah, I got that figure. He's right. He's right.
yeah,
Yeah,
dipping
he's
back it. Well, and the fact that they do the comics, they do the movies, they do the like when they sink their teeth in when they get to stuff. But you're right, like we grew up with that, but now that's really not even a thing anymore. Like
yeah.
think about all the barbarian movies in the 80s
I know. Yeah,
and now nothing.
yeah. I
We get
agree. Yeah, it's well. I mean, and it's partly like um, you know the confluence of things that happen with Conan and you know you had people growing up on the '70s Marvel comics, and you had all those people growing up reading Robert Howard, and then you know you make a blockbuster movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's like these are like once in a you know a century sort of
things
confluences and things.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And then and just that wave of barbarian stuff. I mean, and it is one of my favorite things on earth is that those area of barbarian movies. But part of that is like people went, hey, it's not cheap. It's not very expensive to film a movie in a
right.
with a, with a sword and a thong, and then you just need a dusty place. Like we did, you know, like or just like some jungle shit in Argentina and build a set, whatever. You know, like that's such a moment. And I think, you know, it's just harder to do now. I think with the cost of movies and stuff and the amount of sort of competition you have, and it's just yeah, it's tougher. It is tougher for sure. I think you know, having worked on He Man, I'm doing this new stuff with Turtles of Grayskull and stuff like. You see the parts of it that are absolutely evergreen in it. You can see it. You know, it's like, oh, this connects to everybody. Everybody gets Skeletor. Like he's a meme. You know, like you don't have to know. I teach at college. My kids know who Skeletor is. Even if they don't know who He Man is, they're like, oh, that's Skeletor. That
Yeah.
guy's, you know, because he's a meme. So there's things that do always connect, but reestablishing that connection to the story and stuff is gonna take a little work.
Well, and that stuff it's very interesting because I love those Masters mashup lines that have because before they had the WWE
Yeah,
Masters Universe mashup line. Uh, and I was like, okay, this is it. This is
yeah,
what's gonna bring it back. And the origins line still going is incredible to me. And I love the fact that Mattel has basically said, no, we're just sticking with it because it's basically not really at retail anymore, but they're keeping it going. But then we've got Turtles of Grayskull, which is, of course, a genius thing.
yeah,
But what an age we're living in now, where we've got now. Granted, they're Hasbro, GI Joe and Transformers both under the same roof, but we have GI Joe vehicles that transform now.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
that's a thing. We've got Ninja Turtles that are in the world of Masters of the Universe. Like that's a concrete thing, and that's cross licensing, and it's wild. And it's like 9-year-old me would have lost his mind knowing
Yeah,
that that was even a possibility.
I know, yeah, and you see, like, a He-Man Stranger Things figure, and he's like, "Holy shit," you know?
Yeah,
But, I mean, part of it, that's great, and but and it's really cool that we get to have them. It does tell you sort of like where things are though, because you're kind of saying, well, this thing it doesn't get as much excitement by itself, but if we put these together,
Yeah.
you know, I always think of like when I was a teenager, I was in college. Marvel versus DC came out, and that was awesome. We'd all wanted that for years, and it was like a 6 month investment of all this shit. But it was also the worst time in comics sales history.
Yeah.
That they needed to do that is because it was like, well, better pull out everything. It helped, and obviously comics survived, and the market just survived and all those things. But like, these are sort of things that you pull out when you're like, fuck, man, it's things aren't going great. So, the people who buy the majority of Master Universe and GI Joe and Ninja Turtles even are adult collectors.
Yeah.
Turtles always works. I mean, and you see, you can go to Target right now, and there'll be a rack for like adult collector turtle stuff, and then you walk over to the kids section, and there's kids turtle stuff from Mutant Mayhem and stuff. So that works, but like it just tells you kind of where all these brands are, especially with kids. you know,
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that it's interesting though. We talked about the brands that have stuck it out. Turtles basically been around since that 80s cartoon. Like in some
Basically,
form or other, it's just kept going.
yeah, I would call Turtles the most successful brand, maybe besides Transformers. I might call. I mean, I think just overall, Turtles is so reinventable, so eternally toyetic. It's comics always work. The comics right now are still some of the biggest comics. Um, that's incredible. I mean, I think you just like you look at what is, and having worked on all of these things, like part of my job is figure out what it is that makes this work forever.
Yeah.
And the cool thing with Turtles or Transformers or Master Universe, like there's parts in there that always work. You can emphasize one part. You can make a Michael Bay movie and emphasize the mutant and the ninja, or you can make a Seth Rogen movie and emphasize the teenage. It's like there's always these things that make them resonate.
Well, and that's what's fascinating to me is in watching creators work is being able to take things like that and get so many different things out of them. Like if you look at all the different iterations of Batman, like Batman can be everything from a grim, straight up murderer to the Batman we saw in like Brave and the Bold.
Yep, he's super flexible.
So
He's
many, he can have a family, he can be a loner. Like it's just dependent upon what the writer or the creative team want to do with him.
Yeah, I mean he's cross genre, right? You can do a horror story, detective story, superhero story, ninja story, like a martial arts story. You can do anything with Batman, and that's true of the Ninja Turtles, and that's true of a lot of other stuff. And I think Superman is a perfect character as well, but he's slightly less flexible than Batman. You kind of can't separate some elements from him, and he's kind of always a science fiction genre character. There's not a lot of flexibility that way, but I
Well,
think people, they love. I think people in general love Superman more, but Batman is also just everyone's always up for Batman.
Well, I think with Superman, that sort of default stance that a lot of people have of like, oh, he's overpowered and you can't write for him, like that's nonsense.
So
But
lame.
I do think it's one of those sort of widely accepted things
Yeah,
that has hampered the character a little bit in a way that Batman hasn't been hampered.
I mean, I have a rant about Superman that I could go on that lasts like 20 minutes, but I mean, the basic thing that bothers me when people do that is like, they're like, well, you can't relate to me so powerful. It's like, no, that's the point. The
Yeah.
point is that he has all this power and he's still a good person. And I can see why most people can't relate to that anymore because they're like, Elon Musk is cool. But the point is
Yeah.
the point is that he is a god and he still reaches down for the little man, and that's the relatability.
Right.
And that just drives me crazy. Is like you explain that to someone, their eyes go blank. You're like, oh yeah, this is someone who couldn't understand that because they think having power and punishing the weak is the way to go.
You're right. Yeah. Well, and you know
That's
what?
you know.
You absolutely just nailed it. Because it's because while you could if you understand the characters, you could write just as easily for Batman or Superman, but it's that Superman is a loftier concept that is harder for
Yeah,
average people,
terrible.
especially now, to relate to.
Right, yeah. I mean, yeah, most people, I guess, I don't know about most people, but a significant proportion would be like, I would use my money to fight the poor people. And then unless people would be like, if I had power, I'd stand up for the farmers. Like there's
Right. Right.
right.
Well, as we recently found out, it's about half and half right now.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
so this is always an interesting question for me. So going back to when you were kind of discovering comics and creators, like at what point did you start to become cognizant of the names on the comics? Like, because I know when I was younger, it was just, ooh, X-Men, cool, Batman,
Mhm.
cool. And then it was a process of discovering, oh, wait, there are these names in the front, and some
Yeah.
of them draw Batman like I like the way they draw him a little better, or I like the stories they
Yeah.
tell a little better. Like there's this process there. Do you remember kind of discovering that?
Yeah, for sure. For me, it was definitely, it's kind of a weird one, but when I was a kid, I would get a lot. The easiest comics to find in the grocery store because other people didn't buy them except for me was the classic X Men or the Marvel Saga, or
Yeah.
because they weren't the new stuff, you know.
Right.
So like I would get to the grocery store that had comics once 3 weeks or something, and so they were kind of picked over by the time I got there. And so I'd go home with Marvel Saga, and I would see all the old stuff, like it because I was buying them in like 1985 or six or something like that, 85. Um, and so I remember very distinctly being like, "Oh, these comics look old." I knew what an old comic looked like. And so then it was on a trip one time, we stopped somewhere at a gas station at it's crazy, it was an Amish gas station. It was really weird. But it's somewhere in Wisconsin, and they had this stack of comics, and I had we were on a car ride, and my parents bought them for me, and it was a Captain Victory comic from Pacific, and it was drawn by Jack Kirby. And that's when I went, this is the guy who drew the old stuff, but this is a new thing from
Oh,
him. And so for me, it was Kirby, and it was so hard not to, because in the '80s, Kirby kind of faded for a while,
yeah.
unfortunately. And by the time I was picking up comics, Kirby wasn't the superstar he should have been, or had been. And so it was that, though. That was the thing where it was like, this guy, and it was also interesting to me because I think that was the first time I noticed that someone like evolved styles or changed or something, because that shit was even crazier. Like he'd always been really dynamic and done these old things, but I mean these wild things. But this was him doing like really the Kirbyest stylized stuff. So it was definitely Kirby for me, and it was also, if I had sort of a lack of affection for Kirby stuff before that, then after that I was just looking for anything I could find of his. So I was finding the older, Devil Dinosaur and Manhunter and whatever I could get, because it was pretty well run its course by that time. But yeah, so definitely Kirby. And then after that, then it was McFarlane. I think was the next real big one. John
Yeah.
Byrne. Um, you know, John Byrne was a big one for me as a kid. Ron Franz, because he was doing Thor and I loved Thor. And if he would draw anything, I would try to pick it up. And then very early, like Ninja Turtles for sure, because um, we would get we had Walden books, and they would get the Mirage ones and then the Archie ones at the same time. And it was like, wait, this is the real weird one that looks really violent. And I was like, that was the Eastman and Laird one. So that was also just like really understanding. Oh, I see. There's like different ways to do these.
Yeah, and you know what? Again, to go back to Ninja Turtles and maybe one of the reasons it has had the life it's had, that's a good point that the toys, because I never really stopped collecting toys. Like I was still even in high school, like buying stuff on the down low. But I remember the Ninja Turtles toys coming out and being into those and not knowing anything. I believe the toys hit before the cartoon, or at least before my awareness of the cartoon.
It was like real close because
Right.
there was ads in the comic for the toys, if I recall, in the Mirage comic. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right. So, the toys were what got me,
yeah.
and sometime around then is when I discovered comic shops, um, but and I'm glad you brought up buying them in the grocery store, because I think back to, like, Uncanny X-Men Uncanny X-Men and G.I. Joe were the first comics that I was like, "I wanna read every issue of this," and I remember bugging my mom to take me to the grocery store,
Yeah.
but there's no way I had, like, complete runs.
Mhm.
So when I was reading these at the
That's
time, there were for sure gaps, and when I go back and reread now, Like, there will be issues that I don't really remember as well, and I'm like, I know that's one that I couldn't find in Kroger or
Yep.
whatever.
Oh, totally.
But yeah, with Ninja Turtles, it was the same kind of thing you're saying, is that the toys came out and you couldn't really attribute any tone to those. They're just cool toys. And then I saw the Mirage comics in the comic shop. It was I think the first ones I got were those first colored editions where they collected like a few
First.
issues and they
Yes.
colored them. Yeah.
Yes. I had that too. Yeah, I got that when I was a kid.
And I was like, "Whoa, this is like serious stuff." And
Yeah.
I say a kid, but the time frame, it had to be 89-ish because it would have been around the same time as Batman coming out. Because that was, as much as I had been reading comics up to that point, 1989 is when I became a
Right.
full on like comics are my life. This is it. This is everything. So that would have been right around the same time. But yeah, it was interesting that and then the Turtles cartoon, which I had never cared for because it was too silly for me. Uh and so yeah, that kind of taught me about the different things you could do with the same characters.
Yeah, and how flexible the medium is, right? And
Yeah.
how you just try shit out, you know?
All right, so we got to talk about first of all licensing.
Yeah, there you go.
Because we've got Hack Slash, one of my favorite. I can't even categorize it as like a horror comic really because it ended up being so much more than that. When the book started off, and I believe I'm correct in saying I was in from the jump because the goth chick fighting monsters, let's go. I'm in.
All right, all the way up. Yeah, me too.
But I'm interested in the creative progression because if I'm remembering right, it started off where it sort of felt like it was going to be almost a monster of the week type of thing, but you built this mythology and created this world that really became like, and this happens a lot of time with things that are separate from other universes as we know them now, where it sort of feels like, well, this could be happening in any of the other worlds that I'm reading right now, but the world that Cassie and Vlad inhabit really became its own large universe. Did you have a plan from the start of, oh, I am going to create this world with its own magic, its own rules, its own mythology? Or did that evolve as you were able to go forward with your creation?
That's a good question. So the way I approached it, I guess, was at first it was just the one shot. So I was working at Devil's Due, and I was on staff, and Josh said, "Let's try some create our own stuff." But we were at the time putting on GI Joe and Voltron and a lot of that kind of stuff. So the plan was like do something that you can just do like a one shot. Like we're not going to invest in a miniseries, you
And
know?
real quick, let me interrupt you real quick because I like to throw this out whenever I can. People sort of poo poo license stuff all the time. But guess what? License stuff is how
Oh,
creators get
it's
to
how you fund.
make their stuff.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, we use GI Joe money to make Hack Slash 100%.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it was just sort of like let's try stuff. So Josh was working on a sort of fantasy thing, and he kind of said, "Hey, everybody else want to try one?" And I'd had that idea for Hack Slash, but it was kind of just it was a character I knew I was interested in that I could do something with because I'd grown up on B movies. And I was, I didn't have to do any research. I'd already seen all those films. I knew every fucking Freddy film and every Michael Myers. I didn't need to do any research. So it was just sort of like, let's try this one thing. And I found Stefano and I worked together on Micronauts, and we would just talk over online and stuff, and we just got along really well. And I had said, "Hey, I'm going to do this thing. Do you want to draw it? It's horror." And he goes, "Bro, I'm Italian." Yeah,
That's great.
so that we did that first one, but it I would have been okay with I would have understood if that's how, as far as it went.
Yeah.
But then it did well, and so then it was like, "Hey, could you do another one?" But we were maintaining the one shot thing, and I think it was around three, which was the comic book Carnage, where I was sort of like, I'm kind of building this thing, and then I kind of felt like I knew these people were, I knew the world they came from, but when we brought in Evil Ernie on four, basically, where it was like, it's a world where any of these things can exist. That was the idea, And as a kid, as a teenager, I guess my favorite comic, and probably till to this day, it's true, Savage Dragon, which was
Oh,
this just ongoing huge
dude.
meta narrative of which being improv and just rolling with shit and building this massive universe is kind of the thing. And that's what I'd always wanted to have, you know. And so I saw Robert was building that with Invincible, and I was like, "Fuck it, I'm gonna do it with Hack Slash." So you know, and I think the thing with Hack Slash that really made that one work, whereas like maybe some of the other stuff didn't, was that it really is a character story. So yes, there is a bunch of gore and boobs and panty shots and everything else, but the dynamic between Cassie and Vlad is what keeps it going, and that's the thing I was interested in. So like keeping that going and having it be about them and how how they related to each other and how their larger world like turns out that was worth 25 issues one time, and then we went to Image another 30 some issues, and so that was the I think coming into it being open to it being the thing that was my Savage Dragon. I knew I wanted something to be my Savage Dragon, and I wasn't gonna let Robert get away with having fucking Invincible and me not having one. So, uh, so I was it hit at the right time. And I was like, you know what, I can go with this. I can keep doing this. And even when I started Hack Slash, I wasn't even sure I could write an ongoing series. I had no idea. But I was youthful and I had hubris, and I was just like, yeah, I can do it. Fuck it. And so I don't know if I would have been as bold or stupid as a as a 47-year-old as I was as a 26-year-old, but like, there you go.
So, are there any characters that because as you're building this world, obviously you've got other characters coming in that your two primaries are interacting with over time. Were there any characters you brought in that you thought were going to be longer term or recurring that you ended up just not using again? And then were there others that were supposed to be kind of one-time deals that came back later and you
Oh,
weren't expecting it?
nobody that I planned to stay didn't stay, but Pooch was supposed to die in his first appearance. Pooch,
Oh, no.
the skinless, the hairless alien dog that's talked.
Yeah.
He was just a thing in my notebook that I drew at a drink and draw one night with Scotty Young, and I was just like, I got to put that in Hack Slash, and so I did. And there was supposed to be a moment where I know Cassie just blows him away, and then I wrote it, and I was like, and I deleted it, and then Pooch stuck around the entire. He's been there for 15 years, 18, whatever. And then Cat Curio
Yeah.
was another one. She was also supposed to die and never come back, but I just loved her so much. And Sophie Campbell Drew that flashback appearance, and I just loved it. So, and then they got stuck together as cat and dog. So yeah, it just ended up being, so those two specifically for sure. And I almost did a series. I love those characters so much that I pitched Image on a cat and dog series, and I was going to do it for sure. And then my artist kind of backed out, and I just never got it back together. Yeah, nobody got like, oh, that didn't work. Well, I guess
Right.
kind of when we did and it wasn't really, it was when we did the series with my brother and Mike Marisi, we did one with which had this October Born, which was sort of like this evil little kid character who is the son of Sam Hain. That character, I want to do more with him, but then Damian Wayne Robin was sort of becoming his own thing, and I was like, oh shit, kind of the same thing. I mean, it wasn't intentional, but and Damien, I think he had appeared, but he was just sort of like it was like one storyline. And then when they brought him back, it's like, oh, this is the same idea. This is, so he kind of faded away. I definitely want to use something with him. I didn't want to, and then I ended up working on Damian Wayne. I was like, oh, fuck, I can't like, all the ideas
Yeah.
I just had for this character, I just put into the real thing anyway. So, and that was on me. That was like, I just didn't, so that's really the only one I think where I had more plans for that I didn't do, and it's all because of Robin. So
So, um, while we're still talking about hack slash, I got to mention, obviously, we saw there's some Cassie figures out there, uh, and Fresh Monkey Fiction it has produced a couple and has more coming. I talked to Bill a few weeks ago on the show and brought up that Cassie and Vlad, although now Pooch also I think needs to go in
I
there.
wish, oh man.
they'd
I
be
would love that.
perfect fits for Operation Monster Force. But what what is your when you're licensing stuff out like that, what are the conversations you have? What is is it important that the person really get your your property, because there hasn't been a ton of hack slash.
Yeah. I mean, we kinda part of it is we kinda came after the boom for that sort of thing. You know, like, remember there was that line that, Toy Biz did that was, like, indie comic characters, and it had Conan in it, but it also had, body bags and all that shit, and,
Yeah, after Marvel Legends went to Hasbro, Toy Biz kept going and did a
yeah,
lot. They did like a Judge Dredd. They
yeah,
did I mean they did it was a pretty big
it's crazy.
line, but yeah.
It was a great line. But I think it's sort of it was sort of the end of there being and, before that you'd had, like, the Claiborne Moore ones where they did the chaos characters and all that sort of stuff, and by the time Hack Slash came around, that kind of stuff was sort of going away. I don't know why, but it wasn't as big a part of, like, indie characters. It was I think it's hard to make action figures, to make them profitable. Bill will tell you that.
Yeah.
And, you know, so we kinda came in at the end of that. So no matter how successful we were, it's like, it's probably not a thing right now. Um, but I mean, I'll I approach it like this. I don't really care about the money for the license shit that much. What I care about is I would like to have some.
Yeah.
So so we did the Diamond Select Femme Fatale figure statue. We did some of the other ones. The line that that Scud figure behind me, sorry, is from, um, was sort of the line that I thought Cassie was going to go in for that one, but that line got sort of had trouble, so the
Yeah.
Cassie figure came out much later. Um, and so our approach to it kind of has been, I want to do something cool. I want it to be fun. I'd like to get some of those. And I know Bill and I know Toy Otter, and those are great dudes, and I buy their shit. I
Yeah.
have all of those, public domain superheroes that they did, and I have all that sort of stuff. So when they asked, like, "Hey, would you want to do a cast figure?" Like, or did I tell them to do one? I can't remember. I may have told them to do one, and they said, "All right, we don't have a female buck, but we'll get back to you." And then when they came to us to do it, I was like, "Fuck yes!" And then they did for the other line too. Those just are high quality objects for a very specific group of people, and I'm totally okay with doing that. It's like, let's just do fun shit. It's for the fans. I would like some. I have a little corner of my office, which is all the Cassie figures I ever made. Some of them are unofficial because she has been borrowed by a couple indie things, and there's a beer
Yeah.
company that made a hack slash beer without me knowing it. All this shit. And, like, I don't care. Again, that's not an invitation to knock my shit off. But uh, if you do it, just send me one for fuck's sake. So
Well, that's all the stuff we do, because I've done a few things like shirts and stuff for Needless Things, and we've done stuff for Audible Interlude. And like you're saying, like I want to have a shirt for myself is a
yeah,
big thing, but also I just want people to have, like, I'm not worried about the dollar I get from T Public. I
yeah.
want somebody, if they want an Audible Interlude shirt, then they can get one. Like, that's really cool to me.
Yeah, I think, and as a small business, as a small time sort of licensor and creator, that's good enough. I survive on the book sales. That is what I do. I make books.
And and
So,
maybe someday you'll sketch a joke so great that Nickelodeon wants to buy it. But until then,
yeah, right. Yeah, Ninja Turtle. Mutant. Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, that's the. I mean, and these. I guess that's the other thing with something like Hack Slash. Like, we sold the movie rights already, and there is no movie. And so for me, like, that stuff, that part of it is out the door. The only reason to make it is to make the books and sell the books. That's where I make my. That's how I pay for this studio and everything else I do. So that's my focus, and everything else is just cake. So that's kind of, yeah.
so speaking of rights, we got to talk about another comic that just from day one blew me away. That's Revival. You and every single time I want to say Jim Norton, only because that comic. Oh,
Yeah.
what you got?
There's the poster right there for
Oh,
Revival, right behind you. Yeah, there you go.
you and Mike
It
Norton.
might be. Yes, yeah.
My gosh. Well, that's it's. Oh, Jim is always the first name that comes into my head, just because the comedian that I've been a fan of for so long. Um, but I think what blew me away about it is it's such an original concept. You see so many things now that, like with hack slash, I can kind of see your influences and see where so much of it came from. But with revival, it really feels like such an original story. And from issue one is one of those things that's cinematic. It feels like I can see this miniseries or movie or whatever playing out in my head. The way that that it's paced, it felt like such a like landmark of professional learning. Like everything that you had done had kind of led to this expert creation without blowing too much smoke, but it really did feel like, oh my gosh, all the stuff that this guy has been doing, everything that he's learned has come together right here.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. Revival's a weird one because it was very much like kind of, I don't want to say engineered, but I think there was a revelation. There was a realization while I was making Hack Slash that though it works and though it sells and though people like it, um, that it wasn't the kind of thing that was gonna like people knew me and I know this is hard to believe because now no one even knows I fucking draw, but at that time, uh, I was kind of still known as an artist, and I did want to make a transition to writing more stuff, but Hackslash wasn't that window or wasn't that gateway. And a big part of it, like at that time to write at Marvel DC, you kind of had to be a novelist or screenwriter mostly. They weren't hiring indie people, and they were definitely not hiring a guy who, by their perception, made a book that looked like a Zenoscope book or something. It looked like a titty book,
Yeah.
even though it
Yeah.
wasn't. It looked that way, and so there was part of it we were trying to engineer something, and Mike and I both felt the same way. We needed something to that we could do that played to our strengths, our interests, and but also sort of acted as a next step career wise. But because there's a in comics it's like being a pop star. Like you have to be Madonna or Prince. You have to or Bowie. You have to reinvent yourself all the time because otherwise, you become a one hit wonder or you become, sort of mired in a thing that people just get tired of you for. So you really have to take these big swings and you have to do something and if you're smart, you engineer it. So that was the genesis of Revival, which was I had started working in a studio with Mike, but also with Sean Dove, a designer and illustrator, this dude Josh Emmons, who was a comic writer and a programmer, and sitting around with those guys was the genesis of that comic, and that we would throw out these ideas like, well, what could we do? And I had this rough notion of doing a crime series set in my hometown, and I had another rough notion of doing something which was like zombies come back, but they just go back to work. That was my pitch. Zombies come back, but they just go to their jobs. And so, um, and then Mike had sort of that he wanted to do something kind of like small town, like kind of taking advantage of the waiting place and stuff he'd done before. So we just threw that shit back and forth until it became something, which is, and it really was sort of studio. It was all those guys' input that made it what it is. There was one draft of it I did that had all the basics of what you're talking about in that first issue, but there was too much dialogue, and so I gave it to Mike and Josh and Sean, and they just took red markers and they said, "Don't need, don't need, don't need," because I was kind of coming at it from like, well, I got to give people all this information, and I was
Yeah.
worried that people wouldn't understand it, and it was those guys that said like, no, the vibe is what you're going for. Like
Hmm.
the vibe is here. Don't cover it up. And so that was a big education because I think before that, well, the the thing that sells hack slash is a different thing than what eventually went on to sell revival. So it was like really like letting those guys convince me to walk into the vibe. I think that makes that because it was all there. The issue was there. It was drawn. It was just that there was too much shit. And like cutting so much of that stuff out, lets it rely on Mike's storytelling, it lets it rely on emotion. And I think when we hit with that one, it's less sort of my own personal learn, learning to be a better writer, but learning to accept collaboration and learning to take notes, which was super useful because then when I went to work at DC and worked on Batman Eternal, that's what it is. Especially Batman Eternal, which was a group of writers. Like I learned how to say, you know what, it's not about ego. Cut it if you need to cut it. I just want it to be good, and that I think was the real education.
Well, and that's I mean, really, so many other things are skills. You learn storytelling, you learn, drawing, you practice, you get better, you understand what your talents are, what your style is. But what you just said about ego, putting your ego aside and accepting input from other people, that's something some people never do.
Oh, so many.
And
I
and
mean, yeah.
the fact that makes a lot of sense because Revival, it just feels like such a mature work.
It
And
yeah, that's an interesting take on it. Yeah, and I think I mean, and maybe that's the maturity angle of it is just saying I mean, not that any part of me was ever like, "Fuck everybody," "You give me any notes on hack slash, eat shit," but it was a very sort of singular approach, right? It was
right.
just like, "I like this sort of schlock stuff. What if I can make schlock stuff resonant and emotional?" Elevated schlock, I guess, was kind of the approach, but, yeah, I mean, and Revival, I think, is I don't want to say I have resentment about it, but that idea that I said, well, nobody would hire me based on hack slash because it was sort of schlocky. Then Revival, they were like, oh, a serious writer, and that I also kind of,
Yeah.
that's kind of lame too, but it worked. So
But isn't
yeah.
that another element of the creative growth process, is kind of recognizing a lot of times that acceptance or uh, wanting to collaborate or wanting to hire you, whatever the case may be, isn't even about you. It's just about other people and how they perceive things. Like it's nothing to do with your the quality of your work or whether or not you're following what you want to do. It's just how other people see that thing and what they're putting on it from their own perspective.
Oh man, I mean that's the hardest thing to accept. I think in general, it's just you can do everything right, and you can get some kind of stink on you, and it doesn't work, or on a project, and it's just. And the other thing can happen. You can make a total piece of shit, but you get lucky. So, I mean, I think there's both those things where you're just like it's timing. I mean, it's not that I haven't benefited from timing. When GI Joe came out, 9/11 happened the day after, and obviously they're all the patriotism and the sort of
Yeah.
I mean that's a terrible time, but it benefited that book. So timing is also something that you can't control, and so yeah, it's just that you have to accept every once in a while that like you've put something out at the wrong time or that you've done it at the right time. And and a lot of stuff is just that sort of it's an idea whose time has come, right? I mean, like, and that's something you accept. And I think Revival is that, and I'm glad we did exactly what we planned to do. We said we would do enough issues to get the story done, and we did that. And and now it exists. It's out in the world. That's got a giant fucking compendium that is 48 issues worth of shit. So worth it. Definitely an education. And I wouldn't change anything about how we got there, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing is sometimes the road is like not great or not what you want it to be, but then at the end you realize like, well, if I hadn't gone through that shit, this wouldn't be what it is.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. A huge part of everything I think is, there's like a weird acceptance in you have to do this thing where you say, you can't ever go, well, what if this had happened instead? Because you'll go
Right,
crazy.
right. Yeah,
Like,
that'll
what if
drive you
done this?
nuts.
Would it have worked better? Would it be successful? You can't do that, but you can
Doesn't
do
matter.
yeah, right. You can do the thing of sort of saying like, "Oh, here is how these things in my life led me to do that."
So, where is Revival right now?
All the episodes are filmed. I was up on set in New Brunswick. Uh, I saw them filming it. It was really fucking crazy, and so it's in editing and will be delivered to Sci-Fi as according to the producer and showrunner.
Ah, that's fantastic. So, were there any specific and you don't have to go into detail about what's in it at all, but were there was there a moment where you're like, "Holy shit, that's that panel. That's
Oh,
that
dude,
thing." Or
yeah, so much. I mean, I was on the dailies. I would see everything coming in, and and the producer and showrunner are friends. So I was in it. It's not like it was like a Hollywood thing where I'm not involved. but I wasn't there every day, and but when I went to the set, I like I got well, I don't shit, I don't know how much I get. I basically went into a thing where they were doing a big special effects shot, and it was the middle of the night. It was on a road in the middle of nowhere in St. John, and uh, it was so cold. It was so fucking cold, and these hundreds of people, like 100 and almost 200 people, are outside in this cold, like looking at monitors and using a crane and all this shit. And it's just this weird moment. You're like, this exists because I did this. It's because I
Right,
did
right.
this. And it's a really that was a really weird thing. And then when Melanie walked up to me in costume, as Dana, and it's just like, what the fuck? It's just such a weird. Or like when I met Romy, she plays M, and like M is a character I made up when I was like 17, and just to imagine like 30 years before, I had sort of sketched this you know undead teenage girl with a crooked smile and all this shit, and here she is. I created that before Romy was born.
Yeah,
So,
right, right. Oh my
you know,
gosh.
it was weird. It was weird, and just like how you know, there's a whether it's warranted or not, there's like a reverence from the people because you know they all read the comic before they started the show, so they could get a sense of it. So they know like, hey, we're doing this thing based on what you're doing. I mean, they're going to do their own thing with it, but there's a reverence there that you have to kind of get used to, and yeah, it was surreal. Uh, I came back from it kind of shook, I would say is the technical term.
Well, and as you said before, I think a large part of that probably is because Revival is a vibe. Yes, it's a great story. Yes, it's gorgeous art, but it is a unique vibe that you feel as you move through that story. So I'm sure everybody felt that, got that, and had respect for, that it was something a little different that had been created.
Yeah, and I think there was a real the choice of the location and all those sort of things uh, were all done by the showrunner and the producer for the specific reason of getting to that vibe. Like it has
Yeah.
to feel like this small town and this sort of the cabin fever and the suspicion but it's also a little funny, because if you live in the Midwest, people are funny, and also in Canada in general, and so there's all those things that they were making it, they were doing that to maintain that. And I thought it was pretty incredible.
Well, Tim, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This has been a great conversation.
Yes,
Before
thank
we
you.
go, where can we find you online? And is there anything else you'd like to point people towards that you're working on right now?
I'm on Bluesky at Hack and Tim Seeley. I'm still on Twitter, but I don't use it very much. I'm also on Instagram at Tim Seeley, and then I will be doing some cons this coming year. So hope to see you at C2E2 or some of the Galaxy cons I hope to do. And this week, or I guess when this comes out, it'll be last week, probably. Rogue Savage Land just came out, and I'm
Yes.
I'm weirdly proud of it for it being a corporate book that flashes back to a 30-some-year-old comic, 34-year-old. But hopefully, you enjoyed it as much as I did making it.
And also, speaking of Instagram, you've been putting up your own drawings of some classic characters, like comics that I very much remember flipping through previews back in the day and being like, "Ooh, I wouldn't mind ordering an issue or two of that." So you're a good
Yeah,
Instagram follow. I enjoy that's going on, but also your wife. If you want to talk about putting up some cool artwork, do you want to
yeah,
mention her Instagram as well?
yeah. So my wife and I have a comics original art company. We rep some artists. It's called Panel Punk Comic Originals. We are repping creators like Aaron Campbell and Scott Hepburn, Jim Terry, a couple other great artists, some up and coming as well. So go check that out. We've got all kinds of art for sale, and so and my wife, is a huge art enthusiast, and she's also extremely charming. So if you want to watch videos of her being charming and cute, she's really good at talking about original art and stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, man, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Hey, Phantomaniacs, I want to tell you about memberships for the Needless Things channel. We have 3 different levels. Each one has different special perks that will only be available to members. We've got things like special emojis that I made myself, badges, polls that you're going to be able to participate in to determine what we do here on the channel, early access to videos, exclusive live chats, exclusive live streams, lots of engagement, because that's really what I want. I really enjoy the comments here on the channel, even the negative ones. I like getting into that kind of stuff, and I want people to feel like they're more a part of what's going on here. And obviously, I want support for the channel. You know, this stuff, as much as I love doing it and providing it for free, it isn't free for me. So every little bit that we can get helps out. And even if you don't join as a member, thank you for your support, whether liking, subscribing, sharing, whatever it is you do. It's all important. But those memberships, the members are going to get lots of cool stuff exclusive only to them.
Smash that like button if you like Needless Things.